Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you and welcome. Thank you for coming here today to join us. My name is Denise Naku. I'm a faculty member in DePaul's School of Design, and I'm the director of the school. We are here, this is the fourth talk of 2002 with Nneka Sobers, and we're very excited to have Nneka here to present her talk about urban technology and the reimagination of our cities. And before we begin, I'd just like to remind everyone that this event is recorded. The School of Design Talks features a range of speakers across game design, UX, HCI, industrial design, graphic design, activism, emerging technologies, ethics, social justice, and more. Look soon for information about our next and first in-person talk in a while, coming up on April 22nd with Wael Marcos, a graphic designer and type designer from Beirut. And the best way to keep track of and register for our upcoming events is to follow us on Eventbrite, Instagram, or Facebook. And I will add those links in the chat in just a bit. And additionally, most of our events are recorded and you can access them on our YouTube channel. And before we begin, I'd like to share a bit of how our event will go today. After I introduce Nneka, I will pass the mic to her. And we ask that you please hold your questions or post them in the chat. Feel free to use the chat for comments if you like. And then we'll open up for Q&A towards the end. All right. Let me just admit a few more people to the room here. Nneka Sobers is an urban designer and civic technologist who helps city makers leverage technology to increase public good. Working at the intersection of urban planning, design research, and product development, Nneka takes a systems level and empathetic approach to developing digital tools that help make city systems more accessible, inclusive, and equitable. Currently, Nneka is a research and program manager at Cornell Tech's Urban Tech Hub. Prior to joining Cornell Tech, Nneka was a product designer at NYC Planning Labs, as well as a co-founder of a civic tech startup that helped low-income communities crowdfund and implement local infrastructure projects, all through a digital bartering economy. Nneka received a Master's of City Planning from MIT with a concentration in city design and a BA in urban planning with a minor in landscape architecture from Virginia Tech. Please join me in welcoming Nneka Sobers.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Denise. And thank you everyone from coming from where you are to log in and hear a little bit more about how we are shaping our cities through urban technology. And I'm really excited to share some of my ideas and a lot of the questions that I think about in this space with you all tonight. So tonight's talk is about, I'm calling it Who Shapes the City? And it's, again, thinking about urban technology as a way for us to reimagine our cities. And even though this talk is virtual, DePaul's connection to Chicago is actually personally very meaningful to me. 9 years ago, I actually lived in Chicago, and this is the city where I started thinking about a lot of the questions that I'm unpacking with you all tonight. So when I lived in Chicago in 2013, I worked for an urban design architecture firm called Skidmore, Owings and Merle, so SOM. So they're a global, like a major global urban design and architecture firm. So this photo is actually a full-scale model of Chicago that's in the ground floor of the building I worked out of, the Santa Fe building. So if you're in Chicago and you haven't been to the Santa Fe building or been on an architectural tour of Chicago, I highly recommend it, and definitely please stop by and see this model. But this model on my way to work was where, again, I started pondering a lot of the things that I'm talking about today. So when I worked at SOM, I focused on projects. I was an urban design intern, but I focused on projects that were around community-centered urban design. So really trying to figure out how the needs of people directly factor into plans for shaping cities. However, my interest in how people are shaping cities and how cities shape people actually started before my time in Chicago. In fact, these questions or these realizations came to me when I was really young, like middle school, high school. I always had this awareness of how my layout, the layout of my city ultimately affected whether or not I could participate and engage in my community. For example, in middle school and high school, I lived in this part of Virginia, Southeast Virginia. It's like by Virginia Beach, Norfolk. I don't know how many of you all are familiar with that area, but close your eyes and imagine pretty much this area is a typical American suburb. You have single family homes, you have strip malls, you need a car to get literally everywhere. So I didn't have a car during these years, and I really had to rely on my parents to do kind of some of the most basic things like staying after school to participate in clubs, or, you know, even if I needed snacks, we had a grocery store that was like a mile away of where my home was, but we didn't really have adequate sidewalks that were safe to get to that grocery store. So I even needed a ride just to get a mile away to do something as basic as get a snack. So, you know, it was at this young age, I realized that because I didn't have a car, my experiences and how I experienced the city ultimately were rendered invisible. And these frustrations that I had and these limitations that I felt ultimately turned into this curiosity around how other people might also be made to feel invisible because the design of their city didn't meet their most basic needs. So for example, what about people with physical disabilities who also need sidewalks and curb cuts to be able to safely walk to that grocery store, or low-income people, for example, who need affordable housing located conveniently to where they might live and work. So the way that cities are designed are intentional. And the design of that environment reflects the lived experiences who are valued in that community. So these are the questions that really led me to study urban planning, ultimately work in urban design, and now currently I work in a space called urban technology. So in fact, in Arturo Escobar's book, Designs for the Pluriverse, he discusses this very dynamic. In the beginning of his book, he discusses something he refers to as ontological design, so designing the human experience. And he states that when designing tools, we are creating ways of being. We design our world and our world designs us back. An example that he uses in this book of how designing communal housing is, an example he uses in this book is how designing communal housing ultimately designs communal ways of living. And that's a very positive example of how our behavior is shaped by our environment and how our environment can foster these positive ways of living. But what happens if we are designing worlds that are ultimately designing our experiences in a negative way or perpetuating marginalization in our society? So going back to my example about inadequate sidewalks in neighborhoods, if we are designing cities that make it difficult for people with physical disabilities to get to the grocery store, or go to their jobs, or visit their friends and family, then we are designing a world that excludes their experiences. So we are designing an exclusionary city that ultimately perpetuates this kind of exclusionary society. So while this concept of ontological design applies to all scales of design, I'm going to be focusing on how this relates to the ways we shape our cities and how our cities shape us back. And more specifically, how the decisions around whose experiences are factored into how cities are made and how technology actually might be changing this relationship. So in this talk, I'll be dissecting 3 different convergences around how urban design and technology are shaping our experiences. The first convergence that I'll be exploring is how cities and technology even relate to each other. Like, what is urban technology? Why am I using cities and technology in the same sentence? You know, I'll be unpacking these kinds of things. But before I kind of jump into the technology part, I want to take a step back and just help you all understand how cities have shaped our human experiences. So I'm going to just take you through a brief tour of some critical moments in urban design that have shaped our American cities. So let's get started. We are in the mid 1800s, early 1900s, and we are in the midst of a second industrial revolution. So American cities, we're no longer making textiles, we're making some pretty hardcore stuff like steel, we're making automobiles, and this creates a lot of waste. You also have a lot of people, immigrants moving into cities for jobs. So cities at this point are crowded, they're dirty, they're just pretty toxic and just honestly, frankly, pretty gross at this point. So because of how industrialization has made it just really unpleasant to live in our cities, this kind of created the birth of this movement known as the City Beautiful movement. And the purpose of the City Beautiful movement was that architects and engineers were really interested in trying to design cities to be just more pleasant, less crowded, more beautiful. And one kind of pillar that they really focused on was trying to make people have access to more parks, for example. And the reason why having access to park space was important is that this is a time in history where it was believed that having access to fresh air can help people live more healthy, positive lives. So the City Beautiful movement was really kind of the start of trying to beautify our cities, but ultimately make our cities more healthy. And a key person in America who was active in the City Beautiful movement is a person named Daniel Burnham. So I would put a star next to his name since, you know, DePaul's in Chicago, you're all coming from Chicago-based schools. So Daniel Burnham was actually a Chicago-based architect, and he's really important in this movement because Daniel Burnham actually created the first ever master plan in the United States. It was called the Plan of Chicago. So the Plan of Chicago pretty much it celebrated all of the pillars of the City Beautiful movement. It was a plan that strategically made sure that parks were accessible by a broader section of people within Chicago. But what's really important here too is that this master plan ultimately solidified urban planning as a legitimate field. And that means that other people, other kind of architects, engineers were also interested in being part of city making. And this kind of led to this period of technocrats being really interested in trying to develop their own kind of utopian, futuristic, efficient utopias. This is also the age of modernism, where there's just this emphasis on form and function and the efficiency of our lived, or efficiency of cities, really. And this image here is a photo of a model by this influential architect, Le Corbusier, who was an architect who was making a lot of these city utopias, but really focused on ways that cities could be efficient. Like, he really believed that the form of cities, or cities and buildings, should serve as machines for human living. So ultimately, Le Corbusier was really the pinnacle of this ethos of how cities are really about efficiency and function and form, and not so much about the human experience. And, you know, this is also a time in city planning where people who are making cities, like these architects, these engineers, who are predominantly people with a lot of privilege, they're white, they're wealthy, they're in these high-skilled jobs, they're not talking to everyday people who are living in cities, especially the most disadvantaged people of the city. But ultimately, they're the ones with all the power that are deciding how our cities work. So this is a really top-down version of how people with a lot of power, who are ultimately disconnected from everyday city dwellers, are making a lot of decisions without including the voices of people who live in cities. So fast forward to 1956. President Eisenhower has this plan to build an interstate system, a highway system that connects all cities in the United States. So this is important for a lot of reasons, but something I want to emphasize is that this act is really what created our highway system today. And what's important about that is this meant that the federal government had all this money that they're now going to give to cities to build these highways and build this highway system. So this was exciting for politicians and people in power in cities at the time, because they can kind of treat their city like a blank slate. They can just demolish whatever neighborhoods they wanted to build these, you know, really beautiful and grand scale highways. But the question is, you know, if you're going to demolish neighborhoods and cities and to build this highway, who is disadvantaged in this process? And honestly, what happened is that these highways and all this money really became a strategy for a lot of local governments to forcibly displace and destroy low-income and Black and Brown communities in America. And this is a legacy that honestly is still affected our cities even today. So this process of constructing new highways at the expense of destroying low-income Black and Brown communities is what we refer to as urban renewal. And urban renewal, this has touched pretty much all cities in the United States, but I want to focus on a very famous case of urban renewal that happened in my city of New York, particularly Lower Manhattan. So at the time in the 60s, and even a little bit before, the head of city planning for New York was a man named Robert Moses. Robert Moses, technocrat, really wanted to build these large, beautiful highways and systematically destroy Black and Brown communities and low-income communities in New York. And again, had this very top-down way of doing so. But you had this, there were a lot of different designers and activists who were very vocal at the time. But one activist I really want to focus on is this woman named Jane Jacobs, who was an activist and writer who wrote this book called Death and Life of Great American Cities. And Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses were really butting heads around how New York City should be planned for the future. While Robert Moses was focused on, excluding the voices of people who lived in Jane Jacobs' neighborhood, which was Greenwich Village, Jane Jacobs pretty much advocated that cities, what makes cities great is not, these beautiful, futuristic buildings and infrastructure. It's really the people that live in those cities. So instead of urban planning being a top-down process, Jane Jacobs was advocating for urban planning to be focused on the voices and the lived experience of people, of actual people who live in that city. And this was really the start of more people-first community planning. So what's really important about this time is that Jane Jacobs, fortunately, won her fight against Robert Moses, and we have her to thank for Greenwich Village no longer being a highway or not being a highway. And we also have Jane Jacobs, again, an important person at the time, who really shifted urban planning, again, from being focused on these top-down interventions to opening up city planning processes for city planners to intentionally bring in the voices of people who live in cities to shape city planning. So this is a process that we call community engagement, which is the deliberate engagement of the needs of people to factor into the plans for cities. And you might be familiar with community engagement or civic engagement. A common type of community engagement is like a town hall or a city planning commission. So you might have seen some sort of poster or saw something about a meeting that's focused on maybe a new development, a new building that's going to be in your neighborhood. And you might have to go to City Hall at like 2:30 p.m. on a Tuesday to voice your concerns for this development. So that is kind of a common, very traditional type of civic engagement, a community town hall meeting. And for multiple reasons, it's really difficult for people to just drop everything in their lives to be able to participate and voice their needs for the community in this kind of way. And, there are a lot of really interesting government initiatives or design firms that are definitely working hard at making more playful, inclusive types of community engagement. But, in a time like even the pandemic, we've learned that it's still just really hard to be able to meet people where they are and try to set up these kind of very intentional ways of getting people's feedback for important city decisions. So now we're in the present and technology is everywhere and it's changed how we connect, communicate, make decisions. So you may have heard of this term smart cities, but I'm going to use a definition by this professor at Columbia University named Kasim Shepard. But Kasim defines smart cities as a vision of urban development in which multiple information and communication technologies are woven into the built environment to manage or optimize public service delivery. So that was a lot, but in a nutshell, technology such as sensors, apps, so many things are just making it much easier for people, specifically governments, to manage, utilize, and optimize urban systems, or like these different layers within the city. So it's easy to romanticize the potential of technology solving our city's biggest problems. And yes, technology does have a lot of exciting potential, but there are aspects of technology in cities that we should be more critical of. For example, smart cities really started as a way for big tech companies like IBM and Google to sell their IT solutions to fix city problems. So the origins of smart cities actually sounds very similar to where we were in the early 20th century. You know, you have these powerful industry players creating top-down solutions to create a utopian vision of what they think the city should be like. And in this case, you know, there's kind of this push from tech companies that cities should run like computers. But obviously we know that cities are complicated, and we have learned the hard way that the future of cities really has to come from the voices and the people who live in them, especially the most disadvantaged communities. So it's this blend of the potential of technology as well as people-first urban planning that is the foundation of urban technology. So urban technology is the hybrid between technology, urbanism, and the design of both those technological systems and those city systems. So the key intentions of urban technology are to make cities more measurable. So that means being able to maybe generate more data for us to understand the patterns of how our city works. Another intention is to make cities more legible. So using this data to make data-backed decisions around how cities should work, and also to make cities just generally more collaborative. So trying to find ways that governments, residents of the city, and also the private sector to be able to work more fluidly in shaping these city systems. So I use the term city systems a lot. And some examples of city systems would include energy, food waste, infrastructure. You know, these are the different layers of the city. And a way that technology, some examples of how technology can be an overlay in helping improve these kind of systems include, an example I can think of would be traffic sensors. So a lot of cities oftentimes have sensors embedded in roads that could maybe detect different patterns of traffic in the city. And those sensors can communicate with traffic lights to help maybe ease congestion in the city. So that's an example of how something as simple as traffic in the city can maybe be improved and enhanced by some sort of technological layer that can help make more smarter dynamic decisions around how traffic can flow in a city. So that's, you know, one example of, again, how technologies can be an overlay over an urban system. So Archon Fung, a professor at Harvard Kennedy School, has identified 4 ways that tech-enabled innovations, so technology, are transforming our cities. The first innovation transformation, I'm calling it augmented services. You know, this is when technology enables governments to provide services to people through these kind of digital processes, digital tools. So this could be, you know, apps, websites, kind of digital forms. That's one example of an augmented service. Another example of an augmented service is also just technology that can help government measure the efficiency of city services through this kind of automated data. So this is an example. The example that fits here is like the traffic sensor system. So that's kind of data that cities can use to, you know, understand how traffic works in a city. The next transformation is transparency. So technology can help governments release and share data in just more accessible formats. So this is kind of a step beyond what governments kind of used to do and still do, just maybe publishing a PDF report every now and then of some statistics about the city. But actually what's really transparent here is when governments have something like an open data portal, which is like a self-service, a website where you can just download all types of data that the government's collecting to be able to make informed decisions about the city. So an example of transparency in this case could be governments proactively releasing data on air quality, on where trees are planted in the city. And you might be able, if you have the tools, are interested, be able to find maybe gaps and ways that government can maybe improve tree plantings or air quality in the city. So that's an example of transparency that just hasn't been able to be done before when you're just kind of publishing reports or PDFs online or in paper. So the last two transformations are something that Jane Jacobs would be really excited about, co-production and e-democracy. Co-production is the ability for residents to work directly with governments to build and implement different programs, while e-democracy is the ability for digital governments to be a tool for residents to provide direct feedback on policies and different public initiatives. So you can think of e-democracy as kind of a digital form of community engagement, whereas co-production is more of communities being the designer of their own projects. So that's kind of one way to distinguish between those two. So while these transformations are examples of ways that data and digital tools can help improve how governments can provide services to people, or maybe help increase the amount of people who can actually shape the city, these urban transformations also present specific ethical tensions. So expanding on some of the tensions that my colleague at Cornell Tech, Dr. Anthony Townsend, has identified, one of the ethical tensions when implementing an urban tech initiative is this balance between public good and private innovation. Remember when I was discussing the rise of smart cities? This is a great example of that tension. You know, we have big private companies like the Googles, the IBMs, the Amazons of the world who have a lot of money and they're able to develop innovative technology that's just really attractive to people in cities. So, you know, it's great. Amazon is able to deliver your new water bottle in 2 days, but what about the toll that Amazon is creating on local roads, competition with the US Postal Service, and support for local businesses? You know, because Amazon is a private company, they don't have the same incentives as local government to make sure that roads and the local economy are actually healthy. However, governments don't always have the capital or the money or are able to be as nimble as a private company. So this tension is really about how to attract innovation, but not at the expense of public needs. The next tension I've identified is this balance between urban technology helping our cities develop, you know, new transformative systems, or, you know, maybe they're just putting digital band-aids on already broken systems or just the status quo. So, you know, how much is technology fundamentally creating a just, non-exploitative, inclusive system? Or is technology just kind of repackaging some of the same old systems of marginalization in our city and in our society? So this next tension is equity versus efficiency. And equity versus efficiency is something that, you know, I wish wasn't a real tension. I just wish we lived in a world where designing cities in an equitable way was just a given. But when budgets, competing stakeholder needs, and policies come into play, there are some real trade-offs between designing optimally for the needs of our city's most disadvantaged residents, or trying to implement something that's cheap, fast, and, you know, maybe just filling in some just immediate needs of kind of the greater city or something. So these are actually real trade-offs that do happen in city government and urban tech and urban development in general. The final tension that I'm identifying is building versus co-creating. So this is slightly related to the previous tension, but what's different here is the decision to implement urban tech projects for the people or with the people. So instead of the designer always being the expert, co-creation really shifts that power dynamic away from the designer as the key decision maker and broadens decision-making and design power to the community. So, these are kind of these primary tensions that oftentimes arise in urban tech innovation. So for the next part of the presentation, I'm going to be exploring what these tensions and transformations look like in the real world. So I'll be walking you through 4 case studies that are insightful examples of urban technology transformations, as well as the tensions that may arise in these kinds of projects. But one thing I would just like you to note is that the ethical tensions that I outlined honestly apply to all of these case studies and all of these different types of transformations. But for the presentation's sake, I'm just going to go through one transformation and one tension just to kind of provide like a more in-depth example of what that looks like. But I would like to challenge you to think about how maybe other ethical tensions might arise in these projects that I'm about to go through. So again, in this section of the talk, I'm going to be examining this convergence between urban tech transformations and ethical tensions. And the first case study that I want to go through is a very highly publicized and controversial project of a smart city in Toronto known as Quayside or Sidewalk Toronto. So in this case study, I'll be talking more about how urban technology can create augmented services, as well as this tension between balancing public good and private innovation. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with Quayside, but in the planning and tech world, it was a pretty big deal. But for a little bit of background, Google, the company Google, has this parent company called Alphabet. Alphabet created this urban tech lab called Sidewalk Labs in 2015. And pretty much Sidewalk Labs, 2 years after it was formed, struck this huge deal with the city of Toronto to develop a 3.4 million square foot development in Toronto's eastern waterfront. So that's what's outlined here in this slide. So it's a huge area. And one of the major hallmarks of this project was for Sidewalk Labs to incorporate, cutting edge technology to make this waterfront community into a novel smart city. So Sidewalk Labs stated that the project aimed to be a testbed for emerging technologies, materials, and processes in order to address sustainability, accessibility, inclusiveness, and prosperity in urban communities. So with the support of various Toronto City agencies and obviously the backing of Google and Alphabet, this project is actually a really common way of how public and private sectors work together to develop these really complex urban development. So this is something that's known as a public-private partnership. So these partnerships are a way for governments to finance expensive public projects, and in exchange, private companies can make a profit either by maybe getting a head start on some business initiatives or creating maybe some spin-off projects that they can then kind of scale to other markets. So as a smart city, Quayside, Sidewalk Toronto, was truly the city of the future. Sidewalk Labs planned on deploying various scales of technology to make Quayside's urban systems more responsive and effective. So some of the technologies included, houses made of sustainable materials that were powered off of a microgrid using renewable energy. They also had sensors all over the site that could monitor air quality, wind speed, even the usage of some public amenities like waste bins and public benches. They even had self-driving vehicles or a plan for self-driving vehicles that could deliver goods, as well as pretty much replace your need for owning a privately owned car. So, a lot of these technologies too, the whole suite of tools, all of these could be controlled or accessed through your phone. So, it really was a way to get governments, but also just people who live in this area kind of direct access to the technology that's powering their neighborhood. So as the business world was really excited by Sidewalk Toronto, some Toronto residents were growing skeptical of this tech utopia. So think about it. You have a lot of really exciting technology that's in this neighborhood, but at the end of the day, you have a private company who has access to really granular data about you and your life. So also too, government, especially since technology is changing so much, government just has a lack of comprehensive policies that are able to also effectively protect people and the privacy of their data. So, this photo here is an example of, Sidewalk Labs being, trying their best to do a lot of public engagement, community engagement. But again, there was just still this strong, this constant concern around how technology, which was embedded at all scales of this neighborhood, was, maybe really extractive for residents here. So, although there was this backlash and concerns over data privacy, Sidewalk Labs tried to develop many responses to the concerns residents had about their data and how it was going to maybe be used by Google. But, for example, one of the responses that Sidewalk Labs developed were these symbols. Here's a photo of these symbols, which would be stickers that they could put all over the development. And these stickers pretty much were symbols to let people know, what data was being collected on them at the time, how that data was going to be used, where would it be stored. And, we can talk at lengths about whether or not we think these symbols are actually effective enough to make residents feel empowered over their data being collected. But, for the purpose of this talk, I think what's important here is to just state that, even though Sidewalk Labs had all this public engagement, there were just still these fundamental challenges around technology in cities that just can't be necessarily addressed through that measure. So this project, and 2 years into the project, a little over half of the residents supported Sidewalk Labs, so it's not very good. And also too, you had a big group of residents pretty much organizing, and they created this group called Block Sidewalks that really became vocal around concerns over this neighborhood. You also, the Sidewalk Labs also had another blow when the former Information and Privacy Commissioner of Toronto, and Kevokian, resigned from advising Sidewalk Labs' data privacy efforts. So you have the key person, the expert in privacy, advising Sidewalk Labs in this process also stepped down. So it's just not very comforting for residents feeling like their concerns over privacy are being addressed. So with these major blowbacks, the rising of community action and also the whispers of a pandemic, Sidewalk Labs officially ended the project in May of 2020 and, cited economic uncertainty from the pandemic as a reason that, this neighborhood will no longer be built. So, this project is a really fascinating case study of how technology can help public services like transportation, housing, and energy become really effective, efficient, and dynamic. But the major challenge of Quayside were really about this tension between how much power, control, and influence should companies like Google have over public goods. But also too, what is the role of government in protecting the privacy of residents from these kind of extractive, ubiquitous forms of technology? So I'm going to move on to the next case study. I have a few here. So this next case study, I'll be discussing the Hook's WiFi initiative, which is a co-developed community internet network in New York City. Well, it was for a specific neighborhood in New York City called Red Hook. So the main tension in this project is about equitable versus efficient urban systems, but also too, the ability for communities to be able to co-produce, co-create, and build their own kind of urban projects. So as a little bit of background on Red Hook, if you're not too familiar with New York City, Red Hook is a waterfront community tucked away in the western coast of Brooklyn. So it's formerly industrial. And 38% of Red Hook's residents actually live below the poverty line. And this neighborhood is also known to the largest public housing complex in Brooklyn. It houses about 6,500 people, so it's pretty large. This public housing complex is known as the Red Hook houses, just so you know, because I might be saying that a few times. But an MIT article states that in 2014, more than 50% of the residents in the Red Hook houses actually didn't have access to the internet. And this is actually something that really captures a term that I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but the digital divide. And the digital divide is this gulf between people who have access to computers and affordable, reliable internet and those that don't. And, in a time like the pandemic, we now really understand that internet is really important. And honestly, it's a key way for people to be able to access education, maybe access their jobs, to be able to connect with each other. So the digital divide is actually a really important issue of equity, because it's really about how internet is an essential service that pretty much connects people to society and the city. And if you don't have access to affordable and reliable internet, then you won't be able to participate in society. And obviously, again, you have Red Hook houses, which is already low income, doesn't have access to the internet. That's already further marginalizing and disconnecting them from being able to access important services through the internet. So the digital divide is, a pretty big issue in urban tech in general, but manifests especially in this neighborhood. So to address the needs of the Red Hook houses residents, the Red Hook Initiative, which is a local nonprofit that serves this particular area, is a really phenomenal organization, but they're really focused on youth development, community building, and local hiring, again, mainly for the residents of the Red Hook houses. So in the spirit of providing more youth development and community building initiatives, as well as addressing inequities perpetuated by the digital divide, a team at the Red Hook Initiative founded a local and free internet network in 2011. So the purpose of this free internet service, which is called Red Hook WiFi, the purpose of this was to host actually an internet radio station for local people to have their own radio shows. This is a neighborhood that has a lot of local artists, community specific news. So the idea was that, why don't we just have an online radio network where we can, showcase our own talents and, be connected to our own kind of news. But also too, even though this radio project is a great idea, ultimately the ability to have free internet in Red Hook, a place that, most residents or half of residents don't have access to internet, is also really important. So in 2011, and also even now, most people, probably yourself too, we might buy our internet or broadband access from kind of these big internet cable companies. And the way that these big internet cable companies, how their infrastructure is organized, is through kind of this left diagram here, a hub and spoke model. So this means that these big companies who supply your internet have these kind of powerful central hubs that provide service to these smaller hubs that ultimately connect to internet modems, like, your router in your building. However, there is a problem. If there ever is a problem with that central hub, this central hub will no longer be able to provide internet to these smaller hubs. So you might just lose power if there's something wrong with something in the center. And also too, I don't know how much your internet bill costs, but internet isn't cheap either. So, this infrastructure costs money to maintain. And, on top of that, internet companies want to make profit. So that's why internet just isn't really that cheap, even though it's essential. So an alternative model to this hub and spoke model is something called a mesh network. So this is the diagram on the right. And the mesh network replaces that central hub with these kind of independent polynodal hubs. So that means if one hub isn't working, don't worry, you won't lose internet access. You'll be able to get internet access through maybe a network of other hubs. So this is really innovative because it ultimately just requires cheaper infrastructure, and you no longer need like that big proprietary expensive internet provider to be able to get internet. So the Red Hook initiative saw this as an opportunity and became part of this growing movement of community organizers who are trying to install and service, community-owned mesh networks that provide free internet to its residents, which is really exciting. So when Red Hook Initiative actually started training in local residents to install, expand, and pretty much service this Red Hook Wi-Fi, there were a lot of challenges. Business owners were reluctant to give permission to install the routers in their buildings because they felt like maybe they didn't want to be responsible for the internet infrastructure, but they also felt like free internet might invite loiters. So pretty much it was kind of a slow start for the Red Hook Wi-Fi to scale. And pretty much at the end of 2011, they only had 2 routers in this whole neighborhood. And again, this neighborhood's, at least the Red Hook houses, has over 6,500 people. So 2 routers just isn't a lot. So then in 2012, Superstorm Sandy devastates New York, especially Red Hook, because it's, again, on the water. And at the time of the storm, as I mentioned, there are only 2 routers in this whole neighborhood, and there were probably about, on average, maybe 30 people logging on to this free internet. But when Sandy hit, the cable companies didn't have internet access in this whole neighborhood. So how are people supposed to be able to figure out what's happening with the storm or let loved ones know that they're okay? So actually, there was a surge now of people who wanted to use Red Hook's free Wi-Fi. So you all of a sudden went from 30 people logging on average to 300 people logging on at the same time to be able to use this free internet. And because also too, it's the only internet that's available during the storm right now. So seeing this opportunity, the Red Hook Initiative team quickly mobilized and tried to develop different kind of apps that would help people in the Red Hook houses be able to either let people know where they are during the storm or communicate maybe if they need something like food or something like that. So photo on the left is actually a screenshot of this app that pretty much was developed, and it was only available through this local Wi-Fi network. So this was, it actually was, you can access it through text. So you can kind of text where you are, text your needs, and it would populate on a map. So this is an example of a specific app that was developed to service this community, particularly at a very vulnerable time during Superstorm Sandy. And, on the right, this is an image of another app that was developed after Sandy, but it was pretty much an app, again, only available through this Wi-Fi network that only met the needs of this specific neighborhood. It's an app that pretty much showed the times for a bus that serviced this one neighborhood. So, this is, a great example, again, of community-driven efforts to design kind of community, to design for needs of the Red Hook community. So Red Hook's Wi-Fi initiative is an incredible example of harnessing the social capital of a disadvantaged community and channeling that energy into community-led, community-owned services. So when it comes to the tension between equity and efficiency, a mesh network is an appropriate, equitable solution in providing free internet and closing this gap in the digital divide. However, the mesh network, it did have a tricky start. It is a more complicated kind of infrastructure. It may not be as efficient or as powerful as what big internet companies provide, but fortunately, the Red Hook Wi-Fi network was able to grow in coverage and quality, really because it was able to just demonstrate the value of providing essential needs through bottom-up organizing. All right, so the next case study is Desadim, which really embodies the spirit of how urban technology can foster an open and digital democracy. The tension in this case study is about conforming versus transforming government processes through technology. So I'll take you through this. Let me get some water first though. So in 2015, Ada Colau, who is a housing rights activist, became the mayor of Barcelona. And as an activist, Ada has always been focused on making sure that the voices of people directly shape government. So when Ada took office, she wanted to try a new way of making sure that the needs of Barcelona's residents directly informed her mayoral agenda. So shortly after Ada took office, she appointed Francesca Bria, who is a direct democracy advocate and an information technologist. And Francesca was appointed to be Barcelona's CTO, so Chief Technology Officer. Essentially, Francesca is in charge of all technology for the city of Barcelona, which is pretty incredible. So in the spirit of Ada's mission to develop a people-first mayoral agenda, Francesca led a major effort to launch a groundbreaking participatory app, or participatory democracy app, known as Desadim. So Desadim is a free open source website where Barcelona's residents can provide suggestions, have conversations to create, directly create Mayor Colau's action plan. It's also a way for residents to organize and get more information on in-person planning meetings, or they can also just vote directly on budget decisions for the city of Barcelona. So what's exciting about Desadim is that it's a tool for residents to directly communicate and organize with each other, as well as city officials. So it's also a great example of how technology can help augment in-person democratic exchanges. So, for example, if you felt more comfortable using Desadim's website, you can go on Desadim's website, again, connect with local governments, vote in kind of important local government decisions. But you could also find information about your local meeting on Mayor Colau's plan, or you can just kind of go to an in-person meeting. Here's a photo of actually one of the many in-person meetings that happened around Mayor Colau's plan. So another helpful aspect of this tool is that Desadim centralized all efforts around the mayor's action plan. So, this might seem like a very simple thing, but this is huge in government. I mean, think about your city. How many times have you heard about maybe an app where you can request for trash pickup, or, an app that does this other thing that the city provides? There's all these different websites and different initiatives for government, and they're kind of scattered all over the place across these different tools. But Desadim was really a one-stop shop for all types of decisions around the city for residents of Barcelona. So if you had an idea, or if you wanted to find meetings, like town hall meetings, or if you wanted to reach out to a politician, or maybe track the progress of a proposal that you had, you could do this all in just one website. It's just one-stop shop. It's great. So this kind of one-stop shop was really popular and made it really easy for residents of Barcelona to kind of use this tool and engage in decisions about the city. So from 2015 to 2019, when Mayor Colau was kind of shaping her first iteration of her mayoral plan, this is some of the data that Desadim had about their progress in helping create the mayor's plan. So in just those 4 years, when Desadim was developed, they had around 40,000 people actually participate in this kind of mayoral plan city making process. And that includes people who use the Desadim platform, as well as attended in-person meetings. They also had almost 11,000 proposals. So the different people providing 11,000 different ideas of what they think the mayor should do in the city. And those conversations or those proposals happened over 500 in-person meetings that happened at that time, which is huge. And, out of all the proposals that were made by the residents of Barcelona, 72% were actually officially adopted into the mayoral plan. And 40% and pretty much all those ideas composed or created about 40% of the mayor's budget. So that's huge. That 40% of what the city of Barcelona spent money on was directly because of what people what people proposed and pitched in this app and in this participatory city making process. So what's really exciting about Desadim is that, it not only was a tool for Barcelona to develop an app for shaping their city agenda, but because Desadim is an open source software tool, which means that pretty much anyone can use its code and modify it and kind of build their own version of Desadim, Desadim became used as kind of like a suite of tools that other institutions and other countries and other cities ended up using. So examples of cities that actually ended up pretty much modifying and creating their own Desadim app, as well as their own Desadim participatory process were included Helsinki, New York, Mexico City, Kokogawa, Japan. These are just some examples of how Desadim had this global impact in trying to open up government or city processes to the people, all through a digitized process. Another cool part about Desadim, which is one of my favorite aspects, is not only has Desadim created a participatory way for people to shape government, but the app itself was developed in a participatory way. Currently, Desadim is in the process of working with residents across Barcelona, but also across other cities to co-design and redevelop the new version of their app. So again, this is just a great example of participatory making on all scales. So again, when it comes to these tensions between conforming and transforming, this is an example of how technology can make city-making processes more inclusive and open rather than kind of tokenized civic engagement. All right, last but not least, I know I've been going through a lot of case studies, but last and not least, the final case study is a tool called Population Fact Finder. And this project is near and dear to my heart, because before I started my current job, I actually was a product manager for a civic tech team in New York City planning. So pretty much I was part of, it almost felt like a civic tech startup within New York City government, which is pretty exciting. And the team that I was part of, it was a team called Planning Labs. And pretty much our team, we built these different websites and apps that made city planning data just more, and city planning processes just more transparent and accessible to everyday New Yorkers, as well as city planners. A lot of city planners would use our tools to kind of help make their jobs easier. So Population Fact Finder, this specific tool, it visualized census data for New York City. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with census data, but census data is really important because it determines how much money from the government goes to schools, roads, affordable housing, all these things. So to be able to build a tool that made this kind of data accessible to policymakers and city residents is really important. So when I joined the team, Population Fact Finder, one version of it already existed with old census data. But the first iteration of the app was developed actually without input from the people who actually use the app. So when I was tasked to redevelop Population Fact Finder, I wanted to build a tool that was structured around the needs of people. In order to do that, I introduced design research methods to our team process, which is really new. And the design research process that I integrated into Population Fact Finder's Redesign really shifted Planning Lab's model from a designing for approach to more of a designing with co-creation approach to designing these different tech tools as a government. So this is huge. Like, we're actually designing transparent government tools with the feedback of people. But unfortunately, for the sake of time, I think I have to skip a few slides. But again, I could talk about this project in length. I care deeply about it. So I'm more than happy to answer any questions about Population Fact Finder or my time at Planning Labs after the talk. But I'm going to actually have to move forward. Okay, so the final part of this presentation, I'm going to unpack some of the challenges of urban technology, as well as just share my reflections on what is really the role of urban technology in kind of building a more inclusive urban future. So firstly, I'm going to start off with some challenges. And based on some of the challenges that Archon Fung identified for civic tech, the first challenge is still that urban tech runs this risk of technology still driving change. So the innovation to date is in this space has often been driven by the perspectives of technologists. And governments are really trying hard, like governments groups like Desadim or planning labs, the team I was part of, are really trying to speed up the process and be able to take the driver's seat in terms of being more in charge and proactive at building some of these urban tech transformations. But since private businesses prioritize profit and growth, it's really critical that government is able to protect the priorities of people. And that's a really important foundation of urban technology, but we may not be quite there yet in some aspects. And in order to get there, the second challenge is really being able to redesign and retool government. So in order for government to, again, be able to be in the driver's seat of these important urban tech transformations, governments must create new structures and processes that make government more nimble and increase the trust between people and government. So this is kind of, one of the foundations of why I was really focused on developing this design research process within my time at planning labs. And, again, I think this is a great first step, but, it's really important that government be able to have new tools to develop public interest technology that's based on real feedback that addresses the real needs of people, especially those that have been historically disadvantaged or just excluded from city making processes. And lastly, active residence doesn't always mean that all voices are heard. And what I mean by that is when being proactive about engaging and co-developing ideas along city residents, especially marginalized communities, I think there's a lot of parallels between human-centered design research, and community engagement practices. So one of the biggest challenges in this process is making sure that a diverse group of voices are heard and that their feedback is actually meaningfully incorporated in, that city making strategy, that urban tech strategy. But, when it comes to open data, citizen science, participatory planning, you will find that there are like active groups of people who are always willing to give feedback on these kind of projects. But just because you have active enthusiasm, this group of people may not accurately represent the needs of people who are actually going to be impacted by your work. So again, we must really put in that work and making sure that especially underrepresented voices have a megaphone and can, really be meaningfully engaged or incorporated in the design, the co-design of our cities. So the case studies that I presented tonight are examples of some of the key challenges, tensions, and potential of how urban technology can change how we're able to shape cities. And, these are technical decisions that I went through, but these decisions ultimately shape products and services that are made, which then shape our cities and the lives that we live in them. So, and this is why I would like to return to this quote that I started off with at the beginning of my presentation. What this quote really captures is that in order to design an inclusive and equitable world, we must build inclusive and equitable city systems and processes. And that is how we design the inclusive and equitable world that we are striving for. So as a designer, I challenge you with balancing these tensions in all scales of your work, and constantly ground yourself in making sure that you are designing equitable tools, processes, and systems, and ultimately worlds. So thank you.